You know, I mean, the statements that Sheriff Nanos has been making are really disturbing because it looks like he's just lost at sea. It looks like he's out of his depth. He doesn't have control of this investigation.
The statements that Sheriff Nanos has been making are really disturbing because it looks like he's just lost at sea. It looks like he's out of his depth. He doesn't have control of this investigation. He doesn't have leads, and he doesn't even have the ability to exercise restraint in his speech. That was the assessment of defense attorney Jesse Skolter, describing the elected official leading one of the most scrutinized missing person investigations in the country. And that statement was not speculation. It was a diagnosis delivered on the record by an officer of the court about a man who holds the power to clear a man's name and has refused. Think of a door that was kicked in by a SWAT team, the frame still splintered months later, the family still living inside, and the only official statement from the agency that broke it down is that they won't say the family is innocent. The paperwork already knew.
No, we still haven't. As it stands right now, all of the purported evidence that they used to obtain the search warrant that we think was obtained without probable cause, is sealed, and so we can't look at it, we can't analyze it, and the Sheriff Nanos won't tell us what it is.
The central figure in this collapse of accountability is not a hardened criminal. His name is Carlos Palos. His house was raided in Rio Rico, near the Mexico border, in the earliest days of the Nancy Guthrie disappearance. The FBI was there. Deputies shut down the entire road, and then nothing, no arrest, no charges. His lawyer, Jesse Skolter, went on the record to expose the vacuum at the center of the state's case. All of the purported evidence that they used to obtain the search warrant that we think was obtained without probable cause, is sealed. And so we can't look at it, we can't analyze it. And the Sheriff Nanos, won't tell us what it is.
The reality is Pima County took Carlos's phone, they did a download on it, and if there actually was anything against him, we wouldn't be here right now. It's from our perspective, it's very, very clear that they made a mistake. What's not clear yet is the precise contours of that mistake.
This is not a gap in the evidence. This is the evidence. The sheriff's office took Carlos's phone. They performed a full forensic download. They took his DNA via swab. And according to Skolter, the digital record reveals exactly nothing. Pima County took Carlos's phone. They did a download on it, and if there actually was anything against him, we wouldn't be here right now. It's very, very clear that they made a mistake. What's not clear yet is the precise contours of that mistake.
Absolutely, yes. They could come up again. I think I early on said, look, there is no suspects. The family is not suspects. They're not. Now, does that mean that ends it forever? No. What happens if next week somebody calls and says, hey, a family member did this, and here's how I know it? That always opens a door.
But here the bureaucratic machinery shifts from confusion to something more deliberate. Sheriff Nanos, when pressed, made a statement that sounded like a clarification, but functioned as a permanent insinuation. He asserted that no one is cleared. Not really. And then he walked it back only for the family, leaving Carlos and another detainee in permanent limbo. His words, yes, they could come up again. There is no suspects. The family is not suspects. Now, does that mean that ends it forever? No. What happens if next week somebody calls and says, hey, a family member did this? You're eliminated doesn't mean you didn't do it. The paperwork already knew.
Okay for him to simply say, the investigation is ongoing, we're pursuing all leads, and not continue to cast suspicion on people like Carlos or the other individual who was arrested in Tucson by the FBI. And, I think the reason he most likely walked back the statements about the family is public.
This is where the narrative splits. The sheriff could state the investigation is ongoing and say nothing further. That would be legally safe and procedurally correct. He chooses a different path. He clears the family under public pressure while leaving the two men who were raided under a permanent cloud. Skolter articulated the realpolitik behind the press release. It would be perfectly okay for him to simply say the investigation is ongoing, we're pursuing all leads, and not continue to cast suspicion on people like Carlos. I think the reason he most likely walked back the statements about the family is public pressure from the Guthrie family or pressure from the Guthrie family, saying, "What are you doing?"
What I see is, sheriffs are elected officials, they're responsive to voters, and they're politicians. And so this is a politician who's in charge of law enforcement, who's refusing to be accountable, refusing to be...
And that reveals the structural asymmetry. The Guthrie family has access. They have the national platform. They can force a correction. Carlos Palos has a lawyer and a sealed warrant. Skolter diagnosed the root cause with clinical precision. Sheriffs are elected officials. They're responsive to voters and their politicians. And so this is a politician who's in charge of law enforcement, who's refusing to be accountable, refusing to be responsible, and just kind of trying to stonewall and refuse to admit that mistakes have occurred.
Bauerlein, and she was one of the journalists who wrote this big expose over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal, really just detailing all of the shortcomings and issues with the Nancy Guthrie investigation, especially early on. Mistakes that I've talked about that were made for a long time in terms of like inexperienced homicide detectives and the fact that the crime scene was cleared so quickly.
This local implosion of due process has now attracted the permanent record of the institutional press. A Wall Street Journal investigation, authored by reporter Valerie Bauerlein, didn't just summarize the case. It built a chronology of the first 48 hours that reads like a forensic audit of institutional failure. The report detailed inexperienced homicide detectives, a crime scene cleared so quickly it compromised evidence collection, and a specific misreading of physical evidence at the front door that delayed the entire investigative timeline.
There was and we saw it with the Murdaugh case, and we saw it with so many of these cases that you cover, Kohlberg and others. Your opportunity to get the most and best information you can is that first 24 and 48 hours. And there were so many decisions made in that critical time period that were missteps, bad luck, bad calls. And then
Bauerlein described the investigation's critical collapse in terms that should alarm anyone who believes in the chain of custody. Your opportunity to get the most and best information you can is that first 24 and 48 hours. And there were so many decisions made in that critical time period that were missteps, bad luck, bad calls, and then some of that information you were never able to recover.
Your camera operator walking up to the crime scene a couple days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. There was a lot of coverage of the Domino's pizza guy walking up and putting 3 pieces. So I think that, we knew that the crime scene was not kept pristine the way it might have been in other high-profile cases. But that set them really back on their heels. But in fairness, there were some missteps early on, but there were also some really bad luck, right?
The concrete example is almost absurd. While the scene should have been frozen, a delivery driver walked up to the house and left food. Bauerlein confirmed the operational failure. There was a lot of coverage of the Domino's pizza guy walking up and putting 3 pieces. So we knew that the crime scene was not kept pristine the way it might have been in other high-profile cases. But that set them really back on their heels.
Ever really nailed down before was specifically about the blood. I didn't realize, and you reported this, that they initially thought the blood was, what did they think it was, like old blood, or describe that?
It could have been. So Nancy Guthrie had a kind of a phalanx of health problems. She's 84 years old. And one of those problems were heart problems and a pacemaker and things. So is it possible that if she was on blood thinners, for example, if you have a parent or a grandparent who takes those, a nosebleed can cause this profuse bleeding. And I think.
But the most damning detail was medical and immediate. There was blood, significant blood. And the initial investigative assumption was that it was old, unrelated, perhaps from a prior medical event. Bauerlein reported that this assumption was tied to Nancy Guthri's health profile. Nancy Guthrie had a kind of a failure of health problems. She's 84 years old, and one of those problems were heart problems and a pacemaker. Is it possible that if she was on blood thinners, a nosebleed can cause this profuse bleeding? That single assumption, that the blood was old and benign, may have cost the investigation its most critical window.
Some turnover in that division, and Sergeant Stivers, who was the head of the homicide unit, soon to be a lieutenant, getting promoted as we speak, had been disciplined in November for minimizing evidence at a crime scene, and to the point, and in several cases. So I think there was some inexperience and maybe some evidence that this was a department in flux, in the homicide division. So I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody, but there were some mistakes were made.
And that assumption was not made in a vacuum. The Wall Street Journal identified a personnel issue that turns this from a mistake into a pattern. The head of the homicide unit, Sergeant Stivers, had been formally disciplined for minimizing evidence at a prior crime scene. Bauerlein confirmed. Sergeant Stivers, who was the head of the homicide unit, soon to be a lieutenant getting promoted as we speak, had been disciplined in November for minimizing evidence at a crime scene. So I think there was some inexperience and some evidence that this was a department in flux in the homicide division.
I think, yes, he had won. He had narrowly won in November of 24 by a couple hundred votes in a recount. That, in a big place of 1 million people, that is a narrow margin. And he'd been challenged by an insider who he'd sidelined, and he'd also sidelined the head of the union. And there was a lot of bad feeling, and a lot of people were moved after the election. And as you mentioned, there was the vote of no confidence in March, just in his performance in general, not the Guthrie case specifically.
Now zoom out from the blood evidence and the sealed warrant. The institutional failure is not just procedural. It is political. Sheriff Nanos won his election by only a few hundred votes in a county of 1 million. He faced a vote of no confidence from his own deputies. Bauerlein confirmed the timeline. Hay had narrowly won in November of 24 by a couple hundred votes in a recount. That in a big place of 1 million people, that is a narrow margin. There was a vote of no confidence in March, just in his performance in general, not the Guthrie case specifically. The paperwork already knew.
Gung-ho, and like almost wanted to be part of it when they thought that they would maybe be able to help and have a positive resolution and not be able to take credit, but you know what I mean? Almost be like there to say, hey, we solved it. But it almost seems like the more time that goes by and the more...
And then there is the federal dimension. This investigation was never supposed to be a local matter. President Trump weighed in. FBI Director Kash Patel arrived on the ground in Arizona. The full apparatus of federal law enforcement was promised. But Bauerlein's reporting reveals a visit measured in hours, not days. A fly-in, a press statement, and then a strategic withdrawal. She noted that when the case proved difficult and unsolvable in a news cycle, the distance from Washington grew. The question the viewer is left to sit with: what happens when national security optics collide with an unsolvable crime scene and both levels of government realize the evidence cannot support the press release?
Taking the plane records, all the different records, he was on the ground for less than 6 hours on the 9th, right? So he shows up on the 9th and then the next morning tweets out that bombshell, this big break of the video that the FBI, to their credit, had recovered that no one thought. The sheriff had said it was unrecoverable. And he said that night on Hannity, I think this has led to some major breaks in 24, 36 hours. I think, there may be persons of interest. And in fact, there was an arrest. There was a person who was detained that night and later.
Bauerlein tracked the precise timeline of the FBI director's involvement and found it to be startlingly brief. Kash Patel shows up on the ground, but from checking the plane records, the tail, all the different records, he was on the ground for less than 6 hours on the 9th. He shows up on the 9th and then the next morning tweets out that bombshell, this big break of the video. And he said that night on Hannity, I think this has led to some major breaks in 24, 36 hours. There was a person who was detained that night and later cleared. But that's it.
The answer is virtually nothing, except in May when he had that interview with John Hannity again, saying that the FBI had been frozen out of the initial days. And then when we pressed hard for an on-the-record comment from Washington, that was, as you saw as well, look, it is a state investigation. It's not our investigation. We will help when we're asked type thing. So, yeah.
The federal silence since that moment is deafening. Bauerlein's team scoured the public record and found almost nothing. We're really tried to scour Kash Patel's social media, scour his public statements. What has he said since that first big splash? And the answer is virtually nothing. When we pressed hard for the record comment from Washington, it is a state investigation. It's not our investigation. We will help when we're asked.
It's a joint effort, but one person's really in charge. I think the multi-jurisdictional nature here gave a lot of ability to say, that's not us, that's not on us. But I think as a practical matter, if President Trump wanted the FBI to be in charge, my strong sense is they would be.
And here the jurisdictional finger pointing becomes its own form of evidence. The FBI can take over if there is a federal crime, Kidnapping across state lines. A ransom note sent via digital communication. Those triggers exist, but the political will to invoke them appears to have evaporated. Bauerlein delivered the quiet verdict. The multi-jurisdictional nature here gave a lot of ability to say, that's not us, that's not on us. But I think as a practical matter, if President Trump wanted the FBI to be in charge, my strong sense is they would be.
8 hours, there were kind of missed relationship opportunities or something, and not thinking there was any footage recoverable, and there was, and so that things just sort of kind of got off track. But importantly, you know, a lot of people have sought the spotlight in this story, right? A lot of people, not.
And so the forest, to use Bauerlein's metaphor, looks like this. A crime scene was released too early. Physical evidence was misread. A homicide unit was led by a sergeant disciplined for minimizing evidence. An elected sheriff selectively cleared the powerful while leaving the powerless under a permanent cloud. And the federal government, which arrived with cameras and promises, has gone quiet. Bauerlein summarized, there were missed chances in that first 48 hours. There were kind of missed relationship opportunities. And a lot of people have sought the spotlight in the story. The people that are not seeking the spotlight are the only ones who really know.
I think it just was one of those stories where we wanted to find out that there was more going on than appears to be on the surface. And sadly, just as a human being, that's not what we found. You know, so that raises a question, and I think.
And so the question that remains is not whether the case will be solved this week or this month. The question is whether the machinery of justice can self-correct when the people who run it benefit from the confusion. Bauerlein's parting observation was grim and open-ended. I wanted to find out that there was more going on than appears to be on the surface. And sadly, that's not what we found. That raises a question, and I think Sheriff Nanos has said this in his interviews lately. It's not clear whether this is weeks, months, or years from being resolved. The paperwork already knew. The sealed search warrant for Carlos Palos still sits in a Pima County court file, unseen by the public, unchallenged by the FBI. Go find the docket. Look at the case number that remains active without a charge, and ask yourself in the comments below. If the evidence was strong enough to kick down a door, why isn't it strong enough to be read out loud in a courtroom?